We all know that that does not absolve our responsibilities or mine to do what we can to, as a body, to promulgate policy to promote pedestrian safety. I'm proud to have been part of this City Council and the budgets that we have invested in significant dollars for pedestrian safety in the past. Budgets that invest in more sidewalks, pedestrian crossings, and slowing cars down. Even this current budget that we have in front of us reflect pedestrian safety as a priority. But with all things that are vital, all things that are important, we can always do better. And I believe this amendment is a bold statement to do even better to protect our pedestrians and citizens. This amendment is designed to better protect our neighbors who are out walking their dog. It is intended to better protect moms and dads walking their little ones in hand or pushing a stroller. And it is intended to better protect our citizens who are out for a jog or our parents on an evening stroll. So with that, Mr. Mayor, I move to amend the ordinance to insert the following standalone section to read as follows. Of a portion of the funding set aside in the proposed fiscal year 2022, I said that right, capital budget, up to $250,000 shall be used to hire a consultant in order to work with city staff to evaluate and prioritize pedestrian safety projects in the city, with all remaining funding to be used for the design and construction of priority pedestrian safety projects identified by that process. Mr. Mayor, I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
That's your amendment as proposed. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. Further discussion or comment on the amendment?
Mr. Mayor, I would like to add just a couple of things. I wholeheartedly support this proposed amendment and all the things that it not only stands for, but that it intends to do. You know, we have known for quite some time, those of us who are elected officials, but also those of us on the city staff who work in that arena, be it public works, be it traffic engineering, about just how important it is in general within our city, but particularly on the minds of our citizens and constituents, that they live in a place and be in a position where they can enjoy not only real safety on the roadways, in their neighborhoods, on the sidewalks, regardless of what they're doing, headed to work, headed home, just out for leisure. But that real safety also turns into the type of peace of mind that extends to the quality of life that we tout and celebrate and enjoy, and are so fortunate to have here in Greenville. And so you can't have one without the other. Recently, of course, just last weekend, Saturday morning, our city saw a tragedy happen in this instance off of our Augusta Road corridor. And as tragic as that is, we know that in addition to Augusta Road, there are numerous other streets that it could have been that street. And without us doing everything that we possibly can under our control, it could be that other street throughout the city next time. In my time as an elected official, there have been a lot of concerns brought to me, but the most continuous, common, frequently voiced subject is this very matter, right? Is concerns related to traffic, whether it be vehicular speed, whether it be pedestrian proximity, cyclist proximity to vehicles. And so I think, as Councilmember DeWorkin said, it's so important that we have already constructed a budget that will help us address so many related items, but that we accelerate and specify through this amendment a particular approach to do, and I stress, citywide pedestrian safety analysis. So I wholeheartedly support it. Thank you, sir, and I know this will serve us well in the months and years that follow.
Okay. Any further comments?
Yeah, I will echo what Councilmember Brasington said, and I really thank Councilmembers Brasington and DeWorkin for taking the lead on this. What happened on Augusta Road could have happened in any one of the other districts. It is obviously on our mind. We know that many of our most challenging roads are owned by the state. Nonetheless, it is time to work cooperatively with SCDOT, as we have been trying to do, and I really want to commend staff for their quick reaction and for Will's call for their quick reaction. And I just hope our state legislators and SCDOT representatives will continue to work with us and try to get to a yes for solutions rather than an immediate no. So on that, I would say this is an excellent use of funds. I also want to take a moment to commend our first responders, our police officers, our coroner's office, our solicitor's office, all of whom were acknowledged by the family by this tragedy. It really made me proud to be a part of the city and proud to know how hard staff is working to get us to a better, more safe place to live.
Okay. Any other comments?
I do have one final one. I mean, for our shared benefit as members of council, but hopefully for the media or any public, listening to this proposed amendment, it's my view, and I think having talked to colleagues on council preceding this opportunity to make an enhancement to the budget, that specifically what this amendment sets out to do is put us in a position ASAP citywide to either verify, validate, confirm that which anecdotally maybe we are aware or we hear from others, or otherwise to pinpoint places that we might not even be fully aware of now where there are the concerns that we've referenced. But in my view, this would help through data collection, allow us to really stare at and focus in on those areas and prioritize each based on the relative safety, and use it as a platform for us to say, look, here it is. It's not a guessing game, or it's not, an infinite necessarily places of precarious conditions. It's these specific locations which pose the greatest risk. And to Councilmember Dow's point, with the help of any other partner and agency, SCDOT and otherwise, we roll up our sleeves and go to work and just pounce and pound on every one of those identified areas of concern until we can proudly sit back and say, look, we've done our job to deliver and ensure, in this case, this form of safety for the citizens of Greenville. So, Mr. Mayor, thank you.
Thank you.
I would like to say that this has happened several times, particularly in my district: Stone Avenue, Rutherford Road, West Washington Street, the Pete Hollis Highway. That has been, those particular corridors and areas have been a problem, and there have been experiences with death, even on Hudson Street after a flood. I'm just saying. And our first responders have been very helpful. But we need to look at where we, not only the corridors, but where we place things. I supported a moratorium that we did not get to, and one of the reasons is the Arby's on Rutherford Road. It is a place, and the crosswalks there is a danger. We've got to stop putting things in the wrong place. And I noticed that when there was going to be a drive-through convenience in one particular area, we didn't put it because it was in the neighborhood. Well, we put Arby's right there at Viola Street, and now the people are suffering from that. So I'm saying that we have to make sure that if we're going through our new planning, that every neighborhood gets the exact same type of structure. We do need to get someone from the outside to look at these areas and make sure that they're safe. And some of the ones that we've known for years. Right there on Rutherford Road, there's been 3 deaths in the last 6 years. People walking, not even in a car. So I'm just saying, so we've got to be very conscious. And John and I know we're scared to even let kids go to school at the little school that we share off Stone Avenue because you can't see in certain spots. So we've got to do a whole lot better. And the state has a responsibility as well, because many of these roads are their roads. And it's not necessarily, and so the city, we've got to ask them for what we want and demand, because our children and our lives are at stake. And now I'm thinking about the Swamp Rabbit Trail with some things that's going on, and we've known for a while there are some blind spots in some areas, and so we need to continue to look at those as well as the corridors.
Okay, thank you. I'll ask the clerk to call the roll for this amendment.
Okay, Mayor, did we have any opposition to the amendment? Or you want me to call the roll for?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is for the motion to amend. Councilmember DeWorkin?
Aye.
Councilmember Fleming?
Aye.
Councilmember Gibson? Aye. Councilmember Brasington?
Aye.
Councilmember Stahl? Aye. Councilmember Dow?
Aye.
Mayor White?
Aye. And now we have the ordinance as amended, which we'll have the roll call for now if there are no other comments. Okay?
Yes, sir. Councilmember DeWorkin?
Aye.
Councilmember Fleming?
Aye.
Councilmember Gibson?
Aye.
Councilmember Brazington.
Aye.
Councilmember Stahl.
Aye.
Councilmember Dow.
Aye.
Mayor White.
Aye. The ordinance receives second and final reading as amended. Okay, 3B.
An ordinance to provide for the adoption of the city operating budget, its execution and effect for the fiscal year July 1, 2021 through June 30th, 2022, declaring certain tax increment finance revenues net of debt service payments surplus, authorizing the termination of tax increment financing districts, and other matters related thereto.
So moved.
Is there a motion and is there a second?
Second.
Motion and a second. Any further discussion? Clerk will call the roll.
Councilmember DeWorgen.
Aye.
Councilmember Fleming.
Aye.
Councilmember Gibson. Councilmember Brazington.
Aye.
Councilmember Stahl. Councilmember Dow.
Aye.
Mayor White.
Aye. Mr. Manager, the budget receives second and final reading. It's always good news for all you guys. Yeah, we appreciate the great work.
Thanks for the work that went into
Appreciate
it.
the great work and
Matt.
the very clear priorities this council set that's reflected in the budget.
Can I make one interjection on the heels of that, because it's not part of this year's budget, but it has been for discussion, that I'll reiterate as we get through, because we are financially coming out of COVID, and I know our OMB is watching our numbers so closely, but we've had some discussions in work session about a form of a neighborhood dividend. In other words, a small amount of discretionary money for the districts to use for small projects as they see fit, such as was done in 2018. And I just challenge the staff to keep that, on the mind. I would like to hear from staff maybe at mid-year when we see financials coming in after the business licenses, some sort of recommendations on policy of how we could consider that, making a policy going forward at mid-year when we see where we are. So I'll just put that out there as a to be determined, TBD. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Item 5A.
An ordinance to appropriate $8,954,274 in the miscellaneous grants fund and the general fund to recognize funds from the American Rescue Plan Act.
Good evening,
Well,
Madam
just say,
Council.
look at a motion a second first. Is there a motion, please? Motion. Second?
Second.
Okay, thank you. Matt?
Thank you, sir. Good evening. I'm going to give you guys an update on the long-anticipated coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery funds. It's easy to say. The acronyms know better. CSLFRF. Next slide, please. So as you all know, this was a component of the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, which we'll refer to as ARPA for the remaining presentation. As a part of that bill, there was $350 billion set aside for state and local and other units of government. $45.6 billion of that was allocated to what are called metropolitan cities, of which Greenville is one. Greenville's allocation was around $17.9 million. The payments are split over 2 years. The first payment has been received in the amount of $8.95 million, and will receive the second payment in approximately 12 months. The eligible uses for this funding include support for public health expenditures, addressing negative economic impacts caused by the public health emergency, replacing lost public sector revenue, premium pay for essential workers, and investing in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. Along with the list of eligible uses, there are several things that are clearly spelled out that we cannot use the money for. The first is that we cannot use this money to offset revenues lost by an intentional tax decrease. Not so much an issue here, but several units of particularly state and other larger governments are wrestling that, where they had a pre-program tax decrease in their budget, and now they're wrestling with how do we achieve that with this guidance. We cannot use the funding for an extraordinary deposit into our pension fund. So what that means is we can use this if our expense incrementally increases our deposit to the pension fund because we're using it on salary and benefit expenses, but we can't use it to make a above normal deposit to reduce our unfunded pension liability. Funding cannot be directly used for debt service, legal settlements, deposits to reserves, or for general infrastructure spending above the amount allocated under revenue loss. So remember that point, because I'll come back to it. As with anything that comes from the federal government, there are a number of record-keeping and reporting guidelines that we'll have to follow. We have to fully commit the funds by the end of calendar year 2024, and the funds have to be fully spent by calendar year 2026. We have to maintain all records related to the funding from at least 5 years from the date of expense. And we'll have our first interim report due on August 31st, so just here shortly. We'll have to make quarterly reports thereafter, starting with October 31st, and we'll report each quarter that we have funds in use. Next slide. So I'm going to go through briefly the specific use categories and how they apply to the city, and how we're basing our recommendation to you all. The public health category is similar to guidance provided in the previous coronavirus relief funds, otherwise known as the CARES Act. It covers items such as vaccination, testing, contract tracing, and PPE purchases, et cetera. What's different in this situation is these funds are forward-looking, so they only cover expenses incurred after March 3rd, 2021. Most of the city's expenses in this category occurred very early on in the pandemic, and so we don't really have eligible expenses in this category. Next slide. For the category of addressing negative economic impacts, there are a number of eligible uses, including direct assistance to household, businesses, and nonprofits. The city is not a social service provider. We don't have the administrative mechanisms set up to provide direct assistance to household and businesses. And one of the things that we learned trial and error during the CARES Act is any money that we give to a household or a business has to be used for the same restricted purposes that the city uses it. So as you all recall, we had a small business boost grant program that we administered early on in the pandemic. That was non-federal funding because the restrictions we put on the businesses were much looser than the federal government required. That means that we didn't get any federal reimbursement, and if we were to use this money for that purpose, we would have to tie their restrictions to the same kind of restrictions that the city has on the use. The other qualifying use under this category is aid to impacted industries, targeted specifically at the tourism and hospitality industry. But if you read the fine print of the allocation, it says you have to use this funding for supporting the safe reopening of the businesses and industry. And so that's for expenses such as social distancing measures, PPE, things like that, or the planned expansion and upgrade of tourism facilities that was already planned prior to COVID but delayed. So when we look at the eligible uses under this category, the city really doesn't have expenses that qualify. Next slide.
Sorry, Matt, just a quick question. Do we have anything Unity Park related?
Not under that category, because we didn't reduce or delay anything that was planned prior to COVID.
What about the Swamp Rabbit Trail bridges? Planned, not bid.
That is a potential. When I get to our recommendation, we'll talk about how you can get the most out of this money, we think.
Thanks.
For revenue replacement, this allows the replacement of lost revenue relative to the most recent fiscal year before the pandemic. So for us, that would be fiscal year 2019. There's multiple exclusions and a really wacky definition of what the federal government calls general revenue. But we've done the calculation. We know that our eligible lost revenue in the first year of the pandemic was around $24.1 million. So that's a significant impact to us. There's a two-part test to this. First, you have to determine the amount of revenue that you lost. And then second, up to that amount of revenue lost, you can use this money for the provision of government services, police, fire, public works, et cetera. You can also use this money up to the amount of revenue lost for general infrastructure investments. So we'll come back to that. Next slide, please. Premium pay for essential workers is a category that allows up to $13 per hour of additional pay for a maximum of $25,000 per employee, so long as the total compensation for the employee does not exceed 150% of state or county average wage, whichever is higher. There are specific classes of employees that are identified in the ARPA bill, and there is also flexibility for the city to designate additional employees that either work in person with the public or handle items that were touched by other people. The city has a few employees that qualify. We have a number of employees that have worked during the COVID pandemic that have since separated that would qualify for this funding. And the guidance is a little unclear on this point on how we treat employees. And so our recommendation is, based on the small number of employees that would be impacted and the unclear definition on how we treat employees who have separated, we don't recommend this as a funding source. Next slide. Under the water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure category, there are specific types of infrastructure projects that we can invest in. Those that are authorized by the EPA Clean Water and Drinking Water Act, broadband programs that deliver at least 100 megabytes per second of download and upload speeds where physically possible, with service to business or households. So we had talked earlier about the potential for using this for fiber connectivity type programs, but that does not meet the federal definition of a broadband project under ARPA. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry. One last thing on the infrastructure projects. While the guidance is not specifically clear, there are strong encouragements to use labor agreements, community benefit agreements, and prevailing wages at or above local wages as part of ARPA-funded infrastructure projects. Next slide. So given those specific categories of allowed use, the most flexibility for the city to use this money is for revenue replacement. I've told you that we've got over $24 million in identified lost revenue from the first year of the pandemic. We'll get to recalculate this in the future ongoing. If this funding is appropriated as decided by City Council, and that's the agenda item that's before you this evening, we use the money to cover the cost of providing essential services, police, fire, public works, et cetera. That in turn frees up fund balance that we currently would be spending on those services and allows us to use that for other purposes. If we appropriate the money in the general fund, as we propose, it gives us the maximum flexibility for use. If we divvied it up between the parking fund that lost revenue or the hospitality tax fund that lost revenue, we would be limited in then expending those funds for hospitality purposes or parking purposes. And again, we will receive another allocation of this money next year. And so if council decides to do something different with that tranche, you'll have another opportunity next year. That's all I have. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Is it expected to be
Questions from
50% a
Matt?
year?
I'm sorry?
Is it expected to be 50% a year, half 1 year, half even split?
Yes, sir. We've received half already, and we're expected to receive the second half approximately next May.
But we've already qualified with 24 million. We've already met the test.
We
for
could
the-
use our entire allocation, yes, ma'am,
Right.
on lost revenue.
So at some point, you would come back to us with here's what we propose to do with the 8 or 9 million that's been freed up in the general fund.
Yes, ma'am. So the action this evening would appropriate the money, would allow us to spend it on government services or prove that we've spent it on government services. And then at a future date, once we've closed the books on the fiscal year, we say, okay, now we have this much fund balance. What do you all want to spend it on?
Does it not, in essence, increase the available CIP? I mean, okay.
Any other questions? Okay, if not,
Thank you all.
clerk will call the roll.
Councilmember DeWorke?
Aye.
Councilmember Fleming?
Aye.
Councilmember Gibson? Councilmember Brazington?
Aye.
Councilmember Stahl? Councilmember Dow?
Aye.
Mayor White?
Aye. Receives first reading. All right, that is all the agenda items. So, Mr. Manager, do you have anything to add? Or? No, sir. Okay, all right. If not, okay, meeting is adjourned. Cool. Good, good.